Sit back. Are you ready for a peaceful, relaxing sleep? Let yourself be swept away by the story and drift off to sleep. Peace. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. The sea gives and the sea takes. For the people who lived along the fjords and river mouths of early medieval Scandinavia, this was not a poetic idea. It was a daily fact of life. The same waters that carried traders, settlers, and fishermen also carried danger. A sail on the horizon could mean a friend arriving to trade wool for iron, or it could mean an armed crew coming ashore, steer, and kill. The Vikings, so often remembered by history as the raiders who terrorized the coasts of Europe, were themselves no strangers to fear. They lived in a world where raiding was not something that happened to other people far away. It was something that could happen to them from their own neighbors, from rival chieftains, and later, as their wealth and fame grew, from outsiders who had learned the same hard lessons of the sea that the Norse themselves had taught. To understand the Viking Age is to understand not only how these people struck fear into distant lands, but how they built walls, ships, laws, and alliances to keep that same fear from reaching their own doors. This is the story of how the Vikings protected themselves. Chapter 1: A world built on water. Scandinavia in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries was not a single kingdom. It was a patchwork of chieftaincies, petty kings, and regional lords spread across what is today Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The land itself shaped everything. Steep fjords, dense forests, and short-growing seasons meant that farmland was scarce and precious, while the sea offered a faster and often safer path between settlements than the rough interior. Villages, farms, and trading posts clustered along coastlines and river banks, close enough to the water to load ships with timber, fur, but also close enough to be reached in a matter of hours by anyone with a fast vessel and a will to take what was not theirs. This geography created a particular kind of danger. Unlike a walled city in continental Europe, a Scandinavian farmstead rarely had luxury of distance from the sea as a form of protection. A raiding party did not need to march for days through hostile country. To reach its target, it could sail in on the tide, strike at dawn, and be gone again before word had even reached the next valley. The Norse understood this vulnerability intimately because their own warriors used exactly this method against others. What worked so well against Frankish monasteries and English abbeys could just as easily be turned against a Norwegian farm or a Danish marsh market town by a rival chieftain seeking plunder, or by a fleet from a neighboring and often unfriendly region. Because of this, security in the Viking world was rarely about a single strong wall or a single powerful king. It was a layered system built from many overlapping methods, refined over generations. Communities relied on early warning, on fast response, on fortified strong points, on the loyalty of armed free farmers, and on the deterrent value of their own reputation for violence. Every layer mattered because any single layer could fail. A watchman might fall asleep, a fortress might be undermanned, an alliance might collapse. Real safety came only from the combination of all of them working together, and from a culture that trained nearly every able-bodied man to fight from childhood, so that a raid never landed on a truly defense. Chapter 2, is on a horizon. The first and most basic defense against any raid was simply seeing it coming. Scandinavian communities developed networks of watch posts along headlands, islands, and high ground that overlooked the sea lanes most likely to bring danger. These were rarely grand structures. Often they were little more than a raised platform, a stone cairn, or a simple wooden tower where a rotating watch of men, and sometimes women, kept a lookout for unfamiliar sails. In parts of Norway, this system became formalized into what was later known as the Ledang watch chain, a series of signal points spaced so that a warning could travel with remarkable speed. When a lookout spotted an unidentified fleet, the response was immediate. Or a great signal beacon called a vardetter or vit was set ablaze. The neighboring watch post, seeing the flame or smoke, would light its own beacon in turn. In this way, a warning could leap from headland to headland far faster than any ship could sail, racing ahead of the raiders and giving inland communities precious hours, sometimes even a full day, to prepare. Coastal watchers were not chosen at random. In many regions, the duty to maintain a beacon and stand watch was a legal obligation tied to landholding, recorded in local custom, and later in written law codes, such as those of medieval Norway. Failing to light a beacon when danger appeared, or lighting one falsely without cause, could carry serious penalties, because the entire defensive system depended on trust in the signal. A false alarm wasted the strength and grain reserves of every farmer who armed himself and marched to the shore for nothing. A missed warning, Dan, for an entire village. Beyond the organized beacon chains, communities also relied on more informal intelligence. Traders, travelers, and fishermen moving along the coast carried news of unusual ship movements from one settlement to the next. A market town like Hedeby or Kopang, filled with merchants from many different regions, was also a hub of information where rumors of a hostile fleet gathering somewhere along the Baltic or the North Sea could spread quickly among those who had the most to lose. This constant flow of maritime gossip, however unreliable at times, gave chieftains and local leaders a rough sense of where danger might be brewing long before any single beacon was lit. Chapt Indstorstandens ring fortresses of Denmark. Nowhere is the organized, engineered side of Viking defense clearer than in the great circular fortresses built in Denmark during the late 10th century. Structures modern archaeologists, it's called the Trelleborg type fortresses, named after the first one discovered. Sites such as Trelleborg, Furkat, Aggersborg, and Nannebakken were built with the precision that surprises many people who imagine the Viking world as chaotic. These fortresses were laid out as near-perfect circles, with earthen ramparts reinforced by timber surrounded by a defensive ditch, and pierced by gates aligned to the 4 points of the compass. Inside each ring, long, boat-shaped timber halls were arranged in a strict geometric pattern, divided into 4 quarters by roads running from gate to gate. The uniformity of these structures across different sites suggests centralized planning and construction, most likely under the authority of King Harald Bluetooth, who was working to unify Denmark and strengthen royal power during this period. These were not simple refuges thrown together in a panic. Required surveying, coordinated labor, and significant timber resources, evidence of a society capable of large-scale defensive engineering when the threat or the ambition was great enough. The purpose of these fortresses is still debated by historians, but most agree they served multiple defensive functions at once. They could garrison troops loyal to the king, ready to respond quickly to raids or rebellions. They could serve as secure bases from which royal power projected outward, protecting trade routes and enforcing order among local chieftains who might otherwise have raided each other. And in the event of an attack, whether from a rival Scandinavian power or from further afield, they offered a defensible stronghold where people and goods could be protected behind a hind earth and timber walls far sturdier than anything found and an ordinary farmstead. The scale of labor invested in these fortresses tells its own story about how seriously Viking Age rulers took the threat of raiding and invasion. Estimates suggest that building a single ring fortress like Trelleborg required the timber of an enormous number of oak trees and the coordinated effort of many hundreds of workers over an extended period. This was not defense as an afterthought. It was defense as state policy, a physical demonstration that a king strong enough to unify Denmark was also strong enough to protect it. Chapter 4. The Danevirke. The Danevirke, a wall against the south. While the sea was the main highway for raiders, danger could also come by land, and nowhere was this threat more directly addressed than at the Danevirke, a massive system of earthworks stretching across the base of the Jutland Peninsula in what is now northern Germany and southern Denmark. Construction of the Danevirke began as early as the 7th century and continued in stages for hundreds of years making it one of the largest and longest used defensive works in northern Europe. The Danevirke was not a single wall, but a network of ramparts, ditches, and palisades designed to block the narrow land corridor connecting Scandinavia to the Frankish and later German territories to the south. At its greatest extent, the earthworks ran for many kilometers, incorporating stretches of earlier construction into an evolving reinforced barrier. Its purpose was clear and pragmatic: to prevent an army, particularly one from the powerful Frankish kingdom under rulers like Charlemagne, from marching directly into Danish territory. Danish sources and later chronicles connect major phases of construction to specific periods of tension with the Franks, when Danish kings feared that Charlemagne's campaigns against neighboring Saxon peoples might turn northward. The wall was reinforced and extended multiple times over the centuries, including significant work attributed to King Harold Bluetooth. In the same era, he was building the ring-for-ring fortresses, suggesting a coordinated, kingdom-wide effort to secure Denmark's borders on multiple fronts at once. The Danevirke worked not by making an invasion physically impossible, but by making it slow, costly, and difficult to achieve by surprise. An attacking force had to either fight through fortified gates and defended sections, or take a lengthy detour around the earthworks, giving Danish defenders time to gather forces and respond. In this way, the Danevirke functioned much like the ring fortresses and the beacon chains, not as an impenetrable shield, but as a tool at time that bought time, funneled the enemy into predictable and defensible routes, and signaled any potential aggressor that Mark was prepared to make an invasion far more expensive than it was worth. Chapter 5. That the Unedine, a nation under arms. Perhaps the most important defensive institution in the Viking world was not a wall or a fortress at all, but a system of organized military obligation known as the Ledang. This was a levy system through which free farmers across a kingdom were required to provide ships, men, weapons, and supplies for defense whenever the king called for it. Rather than relying on a small class of professional soldiers, the Ledang turned the entire able-bodied male population, at least in principle, into a reserve army and navy that could be mobilized when danger threatened. Under this system, coastal regions were divided into administrative districts, each responsible for building and equipping a certain number of ships with a set number of men. The specific arrangements varied between Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and evolved over time, but the underlying principle remained consistent. Defense was a shared burden distributed across the community according to land holding and resources, rather than left entirely to a king's retinue. The genius of the Ledang lay In peacetime, the ships and equipment maintained under this obligation served as a visible, ready deterrent, a fleet, the fleet that could be assembled quickly if a threat appeared on the horizon. In wartime, or when facing a raid, the same system allowed a king or regional lord to summon a substantial force in a matter of days rather than months. Since the ships were already built, the men already trained in the use of weapons from a young age, and the local organ established. Through years of practice and legal obligation, this system also reinforced social bonds and loyalty. Because the Lighting required cooperation between neighboring farms and villages, it created networks of mutual obligation that extended beyond a single household. A farmer who failed to contribute his share to the local ship levy risked not only legal penalty, but also social shame, since his negligence could endanger the entire community if a raid came before the fleet was ready. Over generations, this shared responsibility for defense became deeply embedded in Scandinavian legal and social life, appearing in provincial law codes that specified exactly how many men, how much grain, and how many weapons each district owed toward the common defense. Chapter 6: The Longship as a Shield. The longship is remembered today as the great weapon of Viking expansion, the vessel that carried raiders to England, Ireland, France, and beyond. But the same qualities that made it so effective for offense also made it central to Scandinavian defense. A longship's shallow draft allowed it to operate in narrow fjords, shallow river mouths, and coastal waters that larger, deeper hold vessels could not enter, meaning that local defenders could intercept raiders in waters where the invaders' own advantages of speed and surprise were reduced. Coastal communities often maintained smaller, faster vessels, specific vessels, specifically for rapid response, distinct from the larger ships built for long-distance raiding or trade. These quicker boats could be launched at short notice by the crews who lived nearest the shore, allowing a local defense force to shadow an approaching fleet, gather intelligence on its size and intentions, and relay warnings inland, even while the larger, slower Ladang fleet was still assembling. Shipbuilding itself was a defensive investment in a very literal sense. Maintaining a fleet in good repair, with dry docks, boat houses, and stores of tar, timber, and rope, was expensive and labor-intensive. But it meant that when danger came, a defensive force did not need to build ships from scratch. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hedeby and various Norwegian coastal settlements shows organized boat-building infrastructure, including specialized boathouses large enough to shelter substantial vessels, some of which are believed to have doubled as gathering points for the Lighting levy. Ships were also used defensively in more direct, physical ways. In several documented instances, Scandinavian communities and later Viking Age rulers used ships themselves as barriers, deliberately sinking old or damaged vessels in narrow channels to block enemy fleets from passing, a tactic also used by the Vikings themselves when attacking others, and turned inward for home defense when the roles were reversed. Wooden stakes and underwater obstructions were driven into ribbeds and harbor entrances as key choke points, forcing incoming ships to slow down, navigate carefully, or run aground, all of which gave defenders critical extra time and the chance to attack an enemy fleet while it was vulnerable and disorganized. Chapinsend and arm RR of the common farmer. Unlike many medieval societies where weapons and military training were restricted largely to a noble warrior class, Viking Age Scandinavia expected ordinary free men to own weapons and know how to use them. Law codes from Norway and Iceland specified the minimum weapons a free man was required to possess, often including a spear, an axe or sword, and a shield, along with penalties for failing to maintain this basic equipment. This was not simply cultural preference. It was a practical necessity in a world where any farm might need to defend itself on short notice long before organized reinforcements could arrive. The spear was the most common weapon among ordinary Norse warriors, valued for its relatively low cost, ease of use, and effectiveness both in close combat and when thrown. The axe, often a repurposed wood-cutting tool, was similarly widespread, requiring less specialized metalworking than a sword, and therefore more accessible to farmers of modest means. Swords, by contrast, were expensive to produce and often passed down as family heirlooms or symbols of status, owned more commonly by wealthier free men, chieftains, and their retainers. Armor followed a similar pattern shaped by cost and availability. Wealthier warriors might own mail shirts, laboriously constructed from thousands of interlocking iron rings, offering serious protection against cutting blows, but requiring significant time and skilled labor to produce. Helmets, when worn, were typically simple rounded or conical designs, and the popular image of horned Viking helmets is a much later invention with no basis in genuine Viking Age archaeology. For most fighters, the primary piece of defensive equipment was the round wooden shield, reinforced with a metal boss at the center, and often covered in leather, light enough to carry easily, but sturdy enough to absorb blows in the close, brutal fighting typical of the period. This widespread distribution of weapons and basic training meant that a raiding party, whether from a rival Scandinavian chieftain or later in the period, from foreign powers seeking retaliation, could rarely count on encountering a truly unarmed population. Even without organized professional defenders present, a Viking Age farming community was likely to include multiple men capable of picking up a spear or axe and putting up meaningful resistance, a deterrent factor that shaped raiding strategy throughout the era. Favoring speed and surprise over prolonged confrontation with an alerted and armed populace. Chapter 8. The Shirite Wall Issue Out Ends. Discipline of Defense. When raiders did make landfall and combat became unavoidable, Norse warriors did not simply rely on individual courage and skill with a weapon. They relied on formation and discipline, most famously embodied in the shield wall, a tactic in which warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their round shields to create a nearly continuous barrier of wood and iron. This formation protected the flanks and vulnerable sides of each individual fighter, allowing the group as a whole to withstand a charge, absorb missile fire, and present a unified front that was far harder to break than any collection of individual warriors fighting alone. Maintaining a shield wall required significant discipline and practice, since a gap or a moment of panic could allow an enemy to break through and attack the exposed sides of neighboring warriors, potentially collapsing the entire formation. Norse sagas and contemporary accounts describe the intense psychological pressure of standing in such a formation, facing an advancing enemy at close range, a test of nerve as much as of physical strength. Leaders and experienced warriors typically held the front rank and the critical flank positions, using their skill and reputation to steady less experienced fighters standing beside them. Defensive use of the shield wall was particularly valuable when a smaller local force needed to hold a defensible position, such as a narrow path, a bridge, or a gate, against a larger raiding party attempting to push inland. By controlling the terrain and forcing attackers into a narrow front, defenders could neutralize a numerical disadvantage, since only a limited number of attackers could engage the shield wall at any given moment, regardless of how many additional raiders waited behind them. Beyond pure formation and fighting, defenders also made extensive use of missile weapons to disrupt an attacking force before it closed to melee range. Bows, though perhaps less glamorized in popular memory than swords and axes, were widely used in Scandinavia, along with thrown spears and stones, particularly effective when defenders held elevated positions such as a fortified hall, a hillside, or the ramparts of fortress, raining projectiles down onto raiders struggling to advance across open or difficult ground. Chapter 9. Saturnhine, fortified towns, and trading centers. As the Viking Age progressed, Scandinavia developed genuine urban centers, and these growing towns required their own dedicated defenses, distinct from the more scattered rural farmsteads. Located near the base of the Jutland Peninsula, was one of the most important trading towns in the entire Viking world. An archaeological excavation has revealed a substantial semicircular lower rampart enclosing the settlement, connected to the broader Dannevirke system, along with a protected harbor entrance that could be closed off in times of danger. Birka, an important trading center on an island in Lake Mälaren in what is now Sweden, similarly featured a hill fort overlooking the settlement, known today as the Borg, along with underwater defensive stakes positioned to obstruct unauthorized approach by ship, forcing incoming vessels toward controlled and monitored channels where the town's own guards could inspect or intercept them before they reached the harbor itself. This combination of a fortified high point and controlled water access reflects a deliberate strategy of layered urban defense, similar in principle to the ring fortresses, but adapted to the specific needs of a busy commercial settlement. Koppang in southern Norway and other emerging trading sites across Scandinavia show similar patterns, even when the archaeological remains are less dramatic than at Hedeby or Birka. These towns depended on trade for their wealth and importance, which made them attractive targets. But that same wealth also gave Taudian authorities the resources to invest in ramparts, palisades, and organized watch systems that individual farming communities often could not afford on their own. The defense of these trading towns also depended heavily on their concentration of population and resources. Unlike a scattered farming district, where raiders might strike an isolated homestead with little warning to neighbors, a town brought together enough people that an alarm could be raised quickly, and a meaningful defensive force assembled within its own walls. Merchants and craftsmen living in these towns, despite not being full-time warriors, were still expected to take up arms in an emergency, and the dense layout of streets and buildings within a fortified perimeter meant that even a breach of the outer defenses did not guarantee passage to the town's wealth, since further resistance could be organized within the settlement itself. Chapter 10. Apten, Aletians, Alliances, Truic, and the Politics of Softy. Not every form of protection came from a wall, a ship, or a spear. Scandinavian chieftains and kings also secured their communities through political means, building alliances, marriage ties, and systems of tribute that reduced the likelihood of attack in the first place. A powerful chieftain with strong ties to neighboring rulers, sealed through marriage or mutual oath, gained a network of allies who might come to his aid if attacked, and who had their own reasons to avoid provoking a conflict that could draw in additional hostile forces. Tribute payments, though most famously associated with the payments English kings made to Viking armies to halt raiding, known to history as Danegeld, were also a tool used within Scandinavia itself between rival powers A weaker chieftain or regional leader might choose to pay tribute to a stronger neighbor in exchange for protection or simply to avoid becoming a target. A pragmatic calculation that trading some wealth for safety was preferable to the far greater losses a raid or invasion might bring. On a smaller and more local scale, the same logic that later drove English and Frankish rulers to buy off Viking fleets rather than risk continued devastation. Marriage alliances between prominent families served a similar defensive function, creating bonds of kinship that discouraged raiding between related groups and established mutual obligations of support in times of conflict. Sagas frequently describe the careful, sometimes ruthless calculations chieftains made when arranging marriages, weighing the military and political advantages a particular merit match alongside considerations of wealth and status, since a well-placed marriage could transform potential threat into a protective ally. Kings seeking to unify larger territories, such Harald Fairhair in Norway or Harald Bluetooth in Denmark, also used the promise of protection as a tool of political consolidation. By offering to defend smaller chieftaincies against external raiders and rival powers in exchange for loyalty and tribute, these ambitious rulers built the foundations of centralized kingdoms, gradually replacing a fragmented landscape of vulnerable, competing local powers with larger, defensible unified states, better able to organize the kind of large-scale defensive projects seen in the ring fortresses and the Danevirke. Chapter 11. Lao, honor, and the deterrence of reputation. Beyond physical fortifications and organized levies, Viking Age Scandinavia relied on a less tangible, but equally powerful form of protection, the deterrent effect of law and reputation. Norse society operated under detailed legal codes, later written down in works such as the Icelandic law collections, which established clear consequences for violence, theft, and raiding committed against fellow Scandinavians. A raider who attacked a community within his own broader legal jurisdiction risked being declared an outlaw, stripped of legal protection, and made subject to lawful killing by anyone who encountered him, a severe and greatly feared punishment in a society where legal standing determines safety and social existence. This legal framework did not eliminate raiding between rival Scandinavian groups, but it did shape and constrain it, particularly within regions that shared common legal traditions and regularly gathered at assemblies known as things, where disputes could be judged and compensation demanded for. Wrongs committed. A chieftain who raided too aggressively within his own legal community risked uniting his neighbors against him, both through the formal mechanisms of law and through simple, practical self-interest. Since unchecked, raiding threatened stability that made trade, farming, and alliance building possible for everyone. Reputation it itself functioned as a form of deterrence in a society that placed enormous value on honor and the memory of a person's deeds, celebrated or condemned in poetry and story generations. A community or a chieftain known for fielding capable, well-armed defenders and for responding to attacks with swift and effective retaliation became a less attractive target than one perceived as weak or poorly organized. Sagas are filled with accounts of raiders carefully choosing targets based on rumors of a community's strength or weakness, weighing well-defended settlements in favor of easier, less costly else. This calculation of relative strength extended to entire regions and kingdoms as well. As certain Scandinavian powers grew more centralized and better able to project organized military force through fortresses, and through royal authority, they became less attractive targets for casual raiding, whether from foreign fleets or rival Norse powers. In this way, the visible strength of a community's defenses served a purpose beyond simply winning a fight if one occurred. It discouraged the fight from happening in the first place, a form of protection built not on stone or timber alone, but on the calculated fear a would-be raider felt when weighing the risks against the potential reward. Turk 12. The other side of the sea, Abyss learns to defend itself. The story of Viking defense is not complete without acknowledging how the very success of Norse raiding forced other societies to develop their own countermeasures, which in turn reshaped the risks Viking raiders themselves faced in later generations. In England, King Alfred the Great responded to repeated Viking incursions by establishing a network of fortified settlements known as burhs, strategically placed so that no part of his kingdom lay far from a defensible stronghold, alongside a reorganized system of military service and a strengthened Royal Navy intended to intercept Viking fleets before they could land. In Francia, similar pressures led to the construction of fortified bridges over major rivers such as the Seine, designed specifically to block Viking longships from sailing further inland to raid towns and monasteries had previously seemed safely distant from the coast. These bridge fortifications, along with growing networks of castles and fortified towns across the Frankish kingdoms, gradually made the deep river raids that had once brought Viking fleets to the gates of Paris increasingly difficult. To repeat, these foreign countermeasures ignored enormously to the Vikings themselves, because they directly affected the calculations chieftains and kings made about where and how to raid, and consequently about how much wealth and manpower needed to be devoted to do their own home defenses rather than to expeditions abroad. As England, Francia, and other regions became better defended over the 9th and 10th centuries, some Viking leaders shifted strategy, turning toward conquest and settlement rather than simple raiding, most famously in the establishment of the Danelaw in England and the Viking founding of Normandy in France, developments that transformed former raiders into rulers who now had to defend their own new territories using many of the same methods, walls, levies, and alliances that had once protected their homelands in Scandinavia. This cyclical relationship between raiding and defense, in which each side continually adapted to the others in innovations, illustrates a broader truth about the entire Viking Age. The methods the Norse used to protect their own communities, coastal watch systems, fortified strongholds, organized levies, and disciplined combat formations, were not unique inventions confined to Scandinavia. They were part of a shared, evolving military logic of the early medieval world, one in which the raiders of one generation frequently became the defenders of the next, and the defenses built against Viking attacks abroad often mirrored in form and purpose the very defenses the Vikings themselves had built at home. Chapter Endurand of Fortresses and at Uon, a new order. By the 11th century, the world that had produced the great ring fortresses, the beacon chains, and the leading levies was beginning to change. Scandinavian kingdoms were becoming more centralized, more thoroughly Christianized, and increasingly integrated into the broader political and religious structures of medieval Europe. Many of the great Trelleborg-type fortresses were abandoned or fell out of use within decades of their construction, their purpose tied closely to a specific period of political consolidation under rulers like Harold Bluetooth, rather than to a permanent, ongoing military need. This did not mean that the need for defense disappeared. Rather, the methods of protection evolved alongside the societies that used them. Stone-built castles, following continental European models, gradually began to appear in Scandinavia, replacing the earthen ramparts and timber palisades of the earlier Viking Age. The Leidang system itself persisted in various forms for centuries in Norway and Denmark, evolving into more formalized royal naval and military institutions. Even as the specific threat of small-scale coastal raiding that had originally shaped it became less central to Scandinavian kingdoms, increasingly focused on continental politics, crusading expeditions, and dynastic warfare. The underlying lessons of the Viking Age, however, did not vanish with the fortresses and the beacon fires. The idea that defense required early warning, rapid mobilization, defensible strongpoints, and a population capable of bearing arms remained deeply embedded in Scandinavian military thinking for generations afterward. The watch systems and legal obligations that had once protected Norse farms from raiding neighbors gradually transformed into the institutions of medieval and early modern Scandinavian states, a direct, traceable inheritance from the defensive innovations first developed to answer a simple question: how does a people who live so close to us to the sea, and who know so well what a determined raiding party can do, keep that same fate from falling on their own shores? Closing, the Vikings are remembered, first and always, as raiders, the warriors who brought fire and steel to unsuspecting coastlines across. But behind every longship that set out from a Norwegian fjord or a Danish harbor lay a community that had spent generations learning, often through hard and bitter experience, exactly how vulnerable a coastal people could be. The beacon fires on the headlands, the earthen rings of Trelleborg and Furkat, the great wall of the Danevirke stretching across Jutland. The spears and shields kept ready in every farmer's hall, and the alliances woven through marriage and tribute between rival chieftains. All of these were answers to the same fundamental problem the Vikings themselves posed to others. In protecting their own shores, the Norse revealed as much about their world as they did in attacking someone else's. A society shaped as profoundly by the fear of the sail on the horizon as by the ambition to raise one of their own.